From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Protesters at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago clash with police outside the Israeli consulate. Let's talk to two reporters who were on the ground. Meantime, on the stage inside the United Center, the party delegates hear from former President Barack Obama, who goes after Donald Trump as an annoying neighbor with a leaf blower outside America's window. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues on the editorial page, Collin, Levy, and Barton, Swaim. The phrase on the homepage of the Chicago Sun-Times newspaper right now, as we're taping this morning, is mass arrests. It says there was a pro-Palestinian demonstration outside the Israeli consulate in downtown Chicago with a violent scrum leading to dozens of arrests, differing reports on the exact number, perhaps as many as 72, according to this news story. But all but unnoticed at the United Center, where another round of Democratic dignitaries take the stage in the lead up to Kamala Harris on Thursday. Let's start with a couple of reporters who were on the ground at that consulate protest. Collin, can you give us a sense of where you were and what you saw unfold?
Sure. Barton and I were right outside where the Israeli consulate is at 500 Madison. So we were definitely right in the midst of what was going on there. I think the reports have been accurate that there were probably a couple hundred, maybe a few hundred protesters there, and probably as many police. And I would really describe the feeling at the protest last night as very borderline. You really had the sense that the protesters were interested in, the feeling of a fluid and volatile and angry protest. They were definitely taunting and testing the police, sort of hoping that the police would get involved with them. There were moments as we were there, when the protesters would give some remarks and they'd do some chants, and then they would just sort of move the crowd for no apparent reason. And the movement would cause the cops to reset and reorganize and create this feeling of instability, even when not all that much was happening. So I think there was real interest there in creating the sense of a ruckus. And I have to say, Kyle, you really have to give enormous kudos to the Chicago police. I thought it was really impressive to see. It was a show of overwhelming force, but also of very good strategic locational planning. I think Chicago really seems to have embraced the broken windows theory of policing to keep things under control. So there were multiple lines of police officers in riot gear on both sides of the street where the protest was being held, and as well as reinforcements at both ends of the block. And at one point, when the Israeli counter-protesters came out and the Palestinian protesters started to advance on the group, they had, by my count, I think about 8 lines of police in riot gear with 4 facing in each direction between the protesters. So it was impressive, and I think they managed to avoid what could have been a much worse event.
Barton, what was your sense? And particularly, some of the news stories are saying hundreds of protesters, several hundred protesters. Did it seem like many of them were trying to instigate something, were interested in getting in these clashes? Or was it just some of the protesters with a mass of people standing around in support? And the dynamic that creates is then the instigators can go start some trouble and then disappear back into the anonymity of the crowd.
I only saw 3 people arrested, so there may have been more elsewhere. But from what I could tell, I came away with the sense that the thing was largely somehow performative. These protesters, in their masks and shouting slogans, they looked and they sounded really, really angry. They sounded like people about to burn the place down. But the only time there were even scuffles, from what I could see with the scuffles with the police, took place when the marchers tried to go down a street they weren't permitted to be on, and the police blocked them, and they got into it a little bit, and I saw a couple of protesters carted away. But I could tell they knew the police weren't going to respond to them in the way they would like. They weren't going to crackheads like this was 1968. So they got in the cops' faces and they shouted profanities. They called them pigs and other things and so on. But other than these scuffles, they didn't really do anything that was going to cause real violence, real havoc. I mean, after all, they got a permit to march in front of the Israeli consulate from the city. An official permit. So these are anarchists with their official permits. Come on. I would echo what Collin said. The police deserve enormous credit for showing up with sort of the Colin Powell theory of crowd control. They just showed up in overwhelming force and they made mayhem totally impossible. But my sense was that these are lost kids full of a poisonous ideology of some kind who are looking in some very dark places for meaning. And is it going to affect the outcome of this convention? I doubt it, despite the number of journalists there last night, probably outnumbering the couple hundred protesters. Things could get ugly on Thursday from what we can tell, but so far it looked largely performative to me.
I would add one more echo on at least the numbers of police. I was going to meet somebody last night, and I don't know Chicago well enough to know exactly even what street I was on, but I hit just a phalanx of police. Never seen so many cops in my whole life with helmets and the nightsticks in a line trying to close off that street. I don't know if I was 1 or 2 or 3 blocks from the protest, but I didn't see a single protester, just some signs on the ground, wanted a sign with Joe Biden's face on it, wanted for international terrorism. It says Joseph Genocide Joe Robinette Biden should be considered armed with nuclear weapons and the U.S. military, expected to arrive in Chicago in August for the DNC unless stopped, is what this protest sign says. So as the police were turning me in a different direction, trying to help me get where I was going, I just spoke to one of them briefly, and he said he was from the suburbs and had been brought up here. So it seems like they were prepared for that. But Collin, correct me if I'm wrong, but hasn't Mayor Brandon Johnson been sort of on the protester side in some senses, saying that he would help them get the audio equipment and so forth that they wanted in order to make their message heard?
Yes, he has. I think that's an important point here. He has been sort of enabling, their louder voices and also using some of the language that they embrace in his own remarks, referring to what's happening in Israel as a genocide. So that is part of what encourages some of the very vicious language that we did hear last night. In addition to the usual cries to globalize the intifada, the protesters were saying things like, there's no room for moderation, not over there and not over here. We heard another protester speaker say that we need to be willing to sacrifice everything in our fight against U.S. imperialism, down with U.S. imperialism and down with the fascist Israeli occupation, down with capitalist pigs. So that's really rough language. But I think what we need to look at here more broadly, politically speaking, is that I think the protesters really wanted to engage with the police and make sure that they got some good optics for their Instagram feeds, for their followers, and make sure they got some headlines about arrests. But I also had the sense that they were, as Barton was saying, not pushing things to the point where it could have actually blown up in a major way. And for all the rhetoric here about wanting to shut down the DNC and damage the Democrats, and this isn't our party, you did kind of have a sense that the protest leaders wanted to make sure that this was on the front page and stealing some of the gas from Kamala Harris and Tim Walz without actually forcing the candidates to get involved or make statements about it or distance themselves from the protesters. So I think it was savvy in that way. I think if things had gotten really violent last night, there would have been calls for the candidates to lay down the line about where they stand and what they would expect from the protesters.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Barton, what about the scene at Union Park a day earlier? My impression, again, just from reading the news report, since I was not there, was that was a much bigger crowd, numbered in the thousands. But what was the story there?
Yes, very large crowd. No good at guessing crowd sizes, but at maybe 7,000, 8,000. It's a really large park, and people spread all over it. I'll have more to write about this weekend on this, but what struck me about the Union Park protest is the sheer number of niche left-wing grievances on display. I'll explain what I mean. The core of it, of course, was the war in Gaza in Israel. That was the stated purpose of the protest. But there were so many other causes in evidence. Of course, there were people chanting about abortion and calling for open borders and police brutality and the like. But there were communists, as in literal communists, wearing hammer and sickle merch. I saw banners saying U.S. out of Okinawa. Another group was proclaiming, end the Korean War. I had no idea what that was about. One lady was shouting to a receptive crowd of about 50 people that they were there in Union Park to oppose U.S. war games in the Philippines. And this she linked to the war in Gaza. I mean, on and on. It was like this, just a huge collection of left-wing grievances. The puzzling question to me was, why are all these groups united by a war in which 0 U.S. soldiers are fighting? There is something decidedly strange and a little creepy about this obsession people have with one tiny strip of land in the Middle East and their determination to twist any set of facts to further the narrative, I guess I'd say, that Israel is committing war crimes. Meanwhile, I would point out that no one at this protest had anything to say about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. No one said anything about the Uyghurs in China, nothing about the civil war in Sudan. They were only interested in what the Jewish state is allegedly doing, which is sort of a mystery I'm in Chicago to try to plumb, and I'll try to say something useful about it in the weekend paper. But there are pretty clearly some foreign influences determined to make Israel the world's villain. And if you were at that rally on Monday, you might say, unfortunately, it's working.
Collin, anything you would add or impressions from you on the Union Park rally on Monday?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with exactly what Barton said. It was like a grocery store of niche grievances. I mean, everywhere you went, there was another interest group with another banner, that all of which seemed to be united only in saying that the Democratic Party didn't necessarily represent them, but, everything from feminists to communists to labor, to climate action, it was everything under the sun sort of laid out there. And I think there is, this just sense among all of these protesters that, just like the Occupy protests, it's like they just want a reason to be out there and to be screaming and to be involved in politics. And this is their unifying theme right now, even if it doesn't really make any narrative logical sense.
But Barton, do you agree with the point that, or the argument that Collin was making, that these protesters are interested in stirring up some trouble, but not enough trouble that it really becomes a problem for the Democrats who are on the stage a couple miles away at the United Center? Because I grant that they don't like Joe Biden. On the other hand, they probably think that Kamala Harris would be a president who would be more interested in listening to them and hearing their grievances, and certainly more so than Donald Trump would be. And if these protests get out of hand in such a way that it becomes a problem for the Democrats in this election, that may be not a path that these protesters are interested in going down either.
Right. I did ask several of the protest leaders at the Union Park event, why did you not show up in significant numbers in Milwaukee in July to the Republican National Convention? And I think I'm being fair in saying I didn't really get a straight answer to that. They just said, we did show up. But clearly, they didn't show up in any kind of numbers. And I do think that the reason for that is that they feel that a President Kamala Harris would bend to their desires more readily than a President Donald Trump would. So in some way, I think it's pretty savvy. And I totally agree that the vast majority of these protesters who are sort of, I hesitate to call them peaceful because, if you're shouting and calling cops pigs and things, is that really peaceful? But they're not actually committing felonies. They're not being literally violent. But I do think that they are coming up to the limit to call attention to their cause without really damaging in any significant way the message that the DNC is trying to get out.